Welcome back everybody to another episode of Direct Comparison. In today's episode, we're going to take a look at the recently released Switch release of Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 1 and 2, and see how it stacks up to the base game running on a PC without any supposed hardware limitations. For this video, the PC version of the game is running at its highest possible settings at a native 4K resolution, providing the best possible presentation for the title, while the Switch version is being recorded in its docked mode. It's for this reason we should of course expect the Switch version to lag behind visually in most areas. But that's okay, because the purpose of this video is to understand exactly what sacrifices had to be made in order to get this game running on Nintendo's hybrid handheld platform, and whether or not this version is worth picking up if given the option. For reference, the Switch in its docked mode seems to dynamically adjust its output resolution between around 720 and 900p, and when in portable mode, the game resolution seems to sit in at around 540p. Also, both of these modes are locked to 30 FPS, with some unstable performance that I'll talk about more in a bit. But first, let's kick this comparison off by looking at some character models and the texture work applied to them, starting with the iconic Hawkman himself. So right out of the gate, we can already observe some stark changes to the quality of this model. Because of the significantly lower resolution, we're understandably going to lose a lot of definition and detail here. Those nice high quality textures on the clothing, like his shoes and socks for example, now come off as blurry and flat. And the aliasing along the edge of the model itself is more noticeable than ever, giving him a more jagged appearance. But those are all understandable sacrifices that had to be made. What's even more curious is that some of the facial geometry seems to have also been tweaked for the skaters, possibly to make up for the lack of proper shadowing used previously to enhance their signature details. I think one of the clearest examples of this is with Rodney Mullen, whose lower jaw and chin looks much narrower now, and his mouth doesn't stretch quite as wide as it should, giving him a different appearance overall. Other perceived differences seem to have more to do with the way lighting interacts with the model itself, with lots of key shadows being removed, like the shadowing under Kareem's hood. But considering how difficult it is to even get a clear view of these skaters' faces and various details when skating around in-game, this isn't nearly as much of an issue as the changes that have been made to the environment. Practically every corner of every level in the Switch release has seen a substantial degradation to its visual presentation. All of the textures, including the walls, ramps, sidewalks, and decorative props, have had their texture quality reduced. And some more decorative assets, like these water pipes at the start of the warehouse, have even seen a surprisingly big hit to their geometric complexity, removing their smooth curved lines and the various fine details around them. Signs on the walls that were previously legible are now nothing more than a blur, and any cracks, debris, and other small touches have been scrubbed away, leaving many areas to feel barren and flat. There's even some much larger decorative assets missing in the levels entirely, like the large sign along the side of the school, and a lot of the building interiors that were visible before through windows are now blocked by new opaque windows instead. You'll also notice a lot of smaller details have been scrapped as well, like the piles of leaves at the base of ramps here, and the dynamic details like the birds that fly away at the start of this ramp seem to just pop out of existence rather than flying off screen like before. Thankfully, despite all of these downgrades, the levels themselves still play exactly the same. There's no missing rails, ramps, or bowls, and every gap, level goal, and special event like that big helicopter crash at the start of the hangar all still function as expected. So, while it's a shame to see the quality dumbed down so much, I'm just glad they didn't have to remove large sections of the level itself like they used to do with older Tony Hawk ports in the past. Moving on, we have the lighting. Here's the big one. The lighting has been greatly reworked with the Switch version, as it's no doubt one of the more demanding visual aspects of the game. Practically all the great volumetric effects used in the base game have either been toned down to the point of being barely noticeable, or just scrapped entirely. This means the magnificent god rays that pour in through the warehouse are no longer visible, and all the bright, foggy lanterns in the night maps are now just lone bulbs in the distance, with no volumetric properties or bloom associated with them. An even bigger hit has been dealt to the game's reflective surfaces. The Tony Hawk remake on every other platform sports some really nice use of screen space reflections to help give some of the levels a newer, next-gen feel. This is most noticeable when skating around the rain-soaked streets of downtown, or pulling off manual combos on the polished floors of the gymnasiums. But the screen space reflections are no more with the Switch release, replaced with either basic cube maps or nothing at all. This lack of reflective surfaces, combined with the muddy textures, makes some levels like downtown feel even more dull than they already were. And it's a real shame considering even the old remake of this level in American Wasteland seems to look better now. Even more surprising is that some levels like Venice Beach have had their coloration completely changed, trading that beautiful golden Southern California sunset with a colder, gray aesthetic. You'll also find countless instances where things like bloom, specular lighting, and even the lens flare have now been removed, giving the overall lighting presentation a noticeably flatter look. Another big visual downgrade to the Switch release is how it handles shadows. The shadows in the base game do a great job casting both important environmental objects like these windows here, and the player model, all with appropriate scaling. But the Switch version's shadows almost look broken by comparison. The finer details of these windows are now lost with lots of jagged edges along the ground, and the player shadow no longer behaves in accordance with the same shadow projection, and instead acts independently, casting a weird, off-scale projection with similarly bad dithering and rough edges. Other, finer details along the surfaces of the environment are now lost as well, due to the less impressive filtering effects, and smaller environmental assets like these mailboxes here in San Francisco no longer cast shadows at all. Then of course, there's the effects. Surprisingly, the effects haven't suffered nearly as big of a downgrade. All of those cool explosions, destruction, and environmental interactivity are still here, and even special effects from tricks like the excessive sparks when grinding along rails with the skateboard's trucks handle more or less the same way. Though, understandably, there are less particles overall, and the particles that are visible aren't nearly as sharp. And before we move on to the sound comparison, I think it's worth bringing up the performance. Now, I completely understand having this game locked to 30 FPS, as they're dealing with much less powerful hardware here, and I would have been fine with a nice steady 30 FPS lock. But unfortunately, that's not really what you get here. Tony Hawk on the Switch feels incredibly unstable. I had multiple instances where the game would stutter throughout sessions, no matter what level was being played. And in some of the larger areas like San Francisco, the performance would fluctuate wildly, dropping down as low as 15 FPS, making precise combos much more difficult to pull off. The performance average is even worse when playing in the game's online mode, to the point where it was pretty much unplayable. Then there's the loading times, that were significantly longer than any other version of the game, often freezing up for a solid 5 seconds whenever a song is changing at the same time. It's a frustrating experience, one that really robs the game of its pick-up-and-play potential, and while the visual downgrades are certainly a disappointment, they would have been perfectly acceptable had the performance managed to maintain something more stable. Finally, let's wrap up with a quick sound comparison. Which version of the game do you think features the superior audio quality? And that wraps up this episode of Direct Comparison. Overall, Tony Hawk Pro Skater 1 and 2 on the Switch is a bit disappointing. I fully expected the visuals to be dropped down a good amount, but as I mentioned before, not being able to maintain that 30 FPS lock really feels like a missed opportunity. It seems clear that porting this game over to the Switch was no easy task, as there's just countless visual sacrifices that had to be made. But considering this remake's biggest selling point is its updated visual design, along with its snappy gameplay and performance, the Switch release doesn't really hit any of these marks properly. And because of this, it's without a doubt the worst way to experience this updated classic. However, all of that being said, the Switch's biggest selling point is still its portability. And being able to take a game like Tony Hawk's Pro Skater out on the go, finally, after decades of wanting a true portable 3D Tony Hawk game, is fantastic. For me personally, this will be my go-to game to play when on plane trips or just bumming around the house. And while yes, there are a multitude of problems, most importantly performance-based, I think the benefit of playing the game untethered does still outweigh those problem areas. But what do you guys think? Are you fine with how Tony Hawk is handled on the Switch? Or were you expecting more? Let me know in the comments section. And if you want to learn more about the remake, be sure to check out my full breakdown of the game and how it stacks up to the original two games in the video linked at the end. And as always, don't forget to like and subscribe for more videos like this posted every week.